House has always meant growing up right in front of the public, from the young Kennedy children playing and showing off for their parents and the cameras, to the weddings of Lucy Johnson and Tricia Nixon, Susan Ford's prom, to a school-age Amy Carter. Being the son or daughter of a president is not always easy. In his new book, All the President's Children, Triumph and Tragedy in the Lives of America's First Families, former President George H.W. Bush aide Doug Wead traces the history of presidential offspring. Doug, good morning. Good to have you here.
Man. Thanks for having me.
From what I understand, the book kind of came out of a conversation you had in 1988 with now President George W. Bush.
That's right. My boss was George W. Bush, but it was his dad's campaign in 1988, and his father just won the election, was the president-elect. We're sitting in his office, we're talking about who goes to transition, who goes to inaugural, who goes to the White House, and suddenly, very uncharacteristically, GW says, kind of sighs, and he says, "What's going to happen to me?" And I was kind of stunned. None of us thought very much about him.
You mean, how's my life going to change now?
I said, "Well, you want me to do a memo on presidential kids?" He said, "Sure." So I spent the next 30 days with my staff, and we whipped 44 pages out.
As you began to research this further and look at the kind of phenomenon of being a child in the White House or after the White House, what were some of the patterns that you started to see come out?
Well, I was first surprised at the stories. We know more about presidential dogs than we do presidential kids.
Right.
And I was amazed at how they impacted history and the romances. I didn't know about presidential daughters sneaking their boyfriends into the White House. And there's even a Ferris Bueller's Day Off where a presidential son sneaks a prostitute into the White House. So
my names on that right here.
My initial reaction was one of shock, and then I was afraid for GW, because I noticed that if a son is named after the dad and is a firstborn, they die. I mean, I thought, you know, there's no curse, but John Adams II died an alcoholic at 31, and William Henry Harrison Jr. died an alcoholic at 35. George Washington Adams committed suicide. Andrew Johnson Jr. died at 26. Calvin Coolidge Jr. died at 16 after an injury on the White House tennis courts. And then after my memo was done, John F. Kennedy Jr. disappeared over the Atlantic. And I'm telling you, chills went down my spine. I thought, this is not a coincidence. There's stress on these kids, and there's some unconscious self-hatred. You know, from the time they're little kids, people say, "When are you going to run for president?" And they don't measure up, and they self-destruct.
As Mary, I think the way you put it in the book is you say that they have undeserved fame or unearned fame. And that's something that's very difficult for some children to come to terms with, isn't it? They figure, I did nothing to bring this fame on myself. Now I've got to go out and take risks and do things to try and at least earn my own sliver of fame.
To get where I already am.
Exactly,
yeah,
which is strange. You mentioned the Adamses. If you look at families, presidential families, the only other time we've had a president raise a president is the Adams family, John and John Quincy. Can you compare the Bushes and the Adams family? I hate to say the Adams family, it always sounds weird.
Now you know what I wrestled with for 15 years in writing it,
right.
The Adams family. No, you can't. They're totally different. George and Barbara Bush deserve to go on Mount Rushmore as presidential parents. They did everything perfectly right. In fact, I once interviewed George W., and I still have the tape, in which he outlines perfectly the steps for raising high-achieving children that the University of Minnesota studies showed, although the interview takes place 2 years before the University of Minnesota concluded its studies. So the Bushes were perfect. John Quincy, pardon me, John Quincy Adams was an aberration. It was, if you can picture an 11-year-old boy and a 40-year-old father in one room in France where they don't know the language, where there's no television, where they're bored to death and they can only trust each other, there was a bonding that took place. There's two future presidents of the United States living in the same room for 2.5 years. It changed John Quincy's life.
You talk about the Bushes being great parents, and I want to mention you work for the Bushes, and so there may be a little bit of a bias there, which is fine. But one of the things you found surprising in your research is that oftentimes presidential couples are good people, but not good parents.
It's striking. It's striking. And the reverse. I found the Clintons as very good presidents, good parents, and they did some things absolutely right with Chelsea that are highly criticized. And Eleanor Roosevelt is a wonderful woman, and we know today, for example, that she fought for the Jews. We didn't know what was going on in that White House we know now. That makes her look even greater. But she was not a great mother by her own admission.
Let me talk about some colorful presidential children.